Siyâvash lived in the shadow of fallen empires, in a silence heavier than the hush that follows clashing swords, deeper than the absence of battle cries. It is the silence of erased histories, of songs swallowed by time, of a people's voice gradually smothered beneath the weight of a foreign tongue. Before we dive into this hidden struggle, I ask you to help preserve these stories. Like this video and subscribe, so the whispers of the past can reach new ears today. This is the story of that silence, and of the man who refused to let it be final. His battlefield was not one of armies or steel, but of words and memory. Siyâvash waged a quiet war, pen against oblivion, resisting an enemy more subtle and unyielding than any conqueror, the slow erasure of a civilization itself. We must travel back 1,000 years to a land of breathtaking beauty and deep unhealed wounds. The land is Persia, a place that once held the world in its grasp, a cradle of kings and prophets, of astronomers and artists. But the Persia of the 10th century is a fractured shadow of its former self. Centuries have passed since its last native emperors, the Sasanians, were swept away by the whirlwind from the desert, the great Arab conquests that forever altered the destiny of the East. The old religion of Zoroaster now flickers like a dying candle in hidden mountain temples, and the language of the court, the melodious Persian of the shore, is being steadily eroded by the dominant Arabic of the new rulers and their faith. The memory of what Persia was, the epic tales of its mythical founders, the grandeur of its godlike kings, the valor of its peerless heroes, is fading into the realm of folklore, dismissed as the fanciful stories of old men and the whispers of a conquered people. In this world of cultural twilight, in the ancient city of Tus, in the far northeastern province of Khorasan, a man named Abdul Kazim Ferdowsi listens. He listens to the stories his father, a landowner of the old noble class, tells him. He listens to the songs of wandering minstrels. He listens to the rustling of the wind through the cypress trees, a sound that seems to carry the echoes of a lost and glorious age. And in the silence between the words, he hears the encroaching void. He feels the soul of his nation going quiet, and a terrifying, magnificent, and ultimately life-consuming purpose begins to take root in his heart. He will not let the voices die. He will gather the scattered embers of his people's memory and breathe them back into a roaring, unquenchable flame. He will build a fortress of words, a sanctuary so vast and so powerful that it will withstand the siege of centuries. He will write a book of kings, a Shahnameh, and in doing so, he will give his lost nation its voice once more. A voice that would echo through the ages, long after the empires that sought to silence it had turned to dust and faded from memory. This is the secret legacy of the man from Tus. The story of how a single voice, armed with nothing but the ink of devotion and the parchment of a fading past, rescued a civilization from the abyss of oblivion. The world into which Ferdowsi was born was a tapestry woven from threads of fading grandeur and vibrant, often violent, new beginnings. To understand the monumental scale of his undertaking, one must first walk the dusty roads of 10th century Khorasan and feel the complex currents of power that defined his age. The memory of the Sasanian Empire, the last great Persian dynasty, was a ghost that haunted the landscape. It was a memory of immense power, of a realm that had stood as Rome's equal for 400 years, a civilization that had produced wonders of art, architecture, and administration. But it was also a memory of a cataclysmic fall, a swift and total conquest that had not only shattered a throne, but had also decapitated a culture. The Arab Caliphate, which had conquered Persia, had brought with it a new faith, Islam, and a new language, Arabic. For centuries, these two forces had worked to reshape the Iranian plateau. Arabic became the language of religion, of science, of government. To be a scholar, a courtier, an educated man, one had to master Arabic. The old Persian language, Pahlavi, with its intricate script, was relegated to the dwindling communities of Zoroastrians, the guardians of a faith now viewed with suspicion. Yet the Persian spirit was not so easily extinguished. It was a deep and ancient river that had simply been forced underground in the courts of local governors and in the private homes of the old landowning nobility. The Duans, to which Ferdowsi's family belonged, the old stories were still told. These were the men who, even as they adopted the new faith, saw themselves as the inheritors of a uniquely Persian legacy. They were the living libraries of a pre-Islamic past, the keepers of a national identity that refused to be assimilated. It was a time of political fragmentation. The great monolithic caliphate of Baghdad was weakening, its grip on the eastern provinces loosening. This created a power vacuum, and into it stepped new dynasties. The most significant for Ferdowsi's early life were the Saanids, a dynasty of Persian Dakwan origin who, while nominally loyal to the Caliph, carved out a vast and semi-independent empire in Central Asia and northeastern Iran. The Samanid court in Bukhara became the heart of a Persian cultural renaissance. For the first time in centuries, the Persian language, now written in the Arabic script and enriched with Arabic vocabulary, was being actively promoted as a language of high literature and poetry. A new generation of poets and scholars began to emerge tentatively at first, and then with a surge of creative energy, they were recovering the lost voice. They began the monumental task of collecting the scattered remnants of Persian history and mythology, piecing together fragments from old Pahlavi texts and oral traditions into prose compilations, creating what were essentially the first drafts of a national epic. It was a fragile dawn, a brief and brilliant window of cultural reawakening. But as Ferdowsi reached manhood, this Persian dawn was threatened by a new and formidable power rising in the south, the Ghaznavids. Led by Turk slave soldiers who had seized power, the Ghaznavids were a martial dynasty, fiercely ambitious and staunchly Sunni orthodox in their faith. Their leader, Sultan Mahmud, was a brilliant and ruthless military commander, a conqueror who would carve out an empire stretching from Persia to India. But his court was culturally different from the Samanids. While he patronized poets, his preference was for panegyrics in Arabic and Persian that glorified his own conquests, not for epics that celebrated the deeds of long-dead Zoroastrian kings and pagan heroes. This was the complex and precarious world Ferdowsi inherited, a land saturated with the memory of a glorious past, experiencing a fragile cultural rebirth, yet facing the rise of a new foreign power that was at best indifferent and at worst hostile to the very soul of that ancient legacy. It was a world teetering on a knife's edge between remembrance and forgetting, and it was upon this edge that Ferdowsi would choose to build his life's work. A testament of such staggering ambition that it seemed like madness, a desperate gamble to save the soul of his world before the twilight deepened into an eternal night. The call to his life's work did not come to Ferdowsi in a single thunderous moment of revelation, but as a slow gathering conviction, a deep and persistent ache in the soul. It was the quiet sorrow of a man watching the tide of his own culture recede, leaving behind the bleached bones of a once vibrant world. He saw it in the way the young people of Tus spoke, their Persian peppered with more and more Arabic words, not out of necessity, but out of a sense of fashion and prestige. He heard it in the sermons at the mosque, where the glories of Arab history were extolled, while the heroes of Persia were ignored or condemned as infidels. He felt it in the very air of his time, a sense of cultural ruthlessness of a people living in a house built by their ancestors, but no longer knowing the names of the architects or the stories carved into the foundation stones. For Fuzzy, this was not merely a matter of linguistic preference or historical curiosity. It was a spiritual crisis. A nation, he believed, was not merely a collection of people living within certain borders. It was a community of memory. Without its stories, a nation was a body without a soul, an empty vessel, adrift on the currents of time. The legends of Persia were not just tales of entertainment. They were the moral and philosophical DNA of his people. The story of King Jamshed, who ushered in a golden age of civilization but fell due to his own hubris, was a timeless lesson in the corrupting nature of power. The tragic tale of the noble Prince Siyâvash, a paragon of honor who is betrayed and murdered, was a profound meditation on injustice and the preservation of one's integrity in a corrupt world. And above all, the saga of the mighty hero Rostam, the flawed but steadfast defender of Iran, was the embodiment of the nation's strength, resilience, and unwavering sense of duty. To lose these stories was to lose the compass that had guided his people for millennia. He saw the work being done at the Samanid court, the prose collections of ancient law, and he recognized their immense value. But he also saw their limitations. Prose could record facts and chronologies, but only poetry, he felt, could capture the fire, the passion, the living heart of the epic. Only the power of verse with its rhythm and melody could bypass the intellect and lodge these stories directly into the soul of the listener to be memorized, recited, and passed down through generations. He envisioned a work of such immense scope and poetic power that it would become the definitive and permanent testament of his people's journey. It would be a book that began at the dawn of creation with the first mythical kings who tamed the wilderness and taught humanity the arts of civilization. It would chart the rise and fall of great dynasties, the Pashadians and the Kayanians, weaving together myth, legend, and history into a single, seamless narrative. It would be a grand stage for a cast of hundreds of characters, noble kings and treacherous usurpers, wise counselors and wicked demons, beautiful princesses and valiant warriors. And at its heart, it would be a chronicle of the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between Iran, the land of the noble Aryans, and Turan, the land of its perennial enemies, a cosmic battle that was mirrored in the moral struggles within each human heart. This was not a task for a single lifetime. It was the work of a generation, a monumental endeavor that would require absolute devotion, immense learning, and a poet's soul attuned to the deepest music of his language. And as the surrounded patronage began to near, and the shadow of the Ghaznavids drew longer, Ferdowsi realized with a chilling clarity that if he did not undertake this task, no one else would. The fragile dawn of the Persian Renaissance was ending, and the window of opportunity was closing. He was already a man of means, a respected landowner with no need to work. He could have lived out his days in comfort and obscurity. Instead, he made a choice. He chose to embark on a journey into the past to become an archaeologist of the soul. He began to gather the fragments, the old prose chronicles, the scattered Pahlavi texts he could find, the oral tales he transcribed from the mouths of Zoroastrian priests and traveling storytellers. He spent his own fortune to acquire these precious sources. He turned his home into a scriptorium, his life into a monastic devotion to a single sacred purpose. For 30 years, he would shut himself away from the world, his only companions, the ghosts of ancient kings and heroes. For 30 years, his pen would scratch across thousands of pages of parchment. For 30 years, he would pour his life, his wealth, and his very soul into the 60,000 rhyming couplets of the Shahnameh. It was a decision born of love and fear. A deep love for the world he was trying to save and a profound fear of the silence that would follow if he failed. The journey into the Sham begins not with a man, but with the world itself, born from the divine will. Ferdowsi, acting as a conduit for 1,000 years of myth, dips his pen into the ink of creation and paints a world of stark and elemental forces. In the beginning, there is only the cosmic struggle between good and evil, between the creator god Ahura Mazda and the spirit of darkness Ahriman. This is the grand theme that will echo through every story, every battle, every human heart in his epic. The first king, Kayumers, is not a conqueror, but a civilizer, a luminous figure who dwells in the mountains, clothed in the skins of leopards, and first establishes the rights of kingship. He is the archetypal father of his people. But his golden age is shattered by the envy of Akhaman, whose monstrous son kills the king's own beloved heir. Thus, from the very first pages, Ferdowsi establishes a central and heartbreaking theme of his work: the fragility of light, the sorrow of loss, and the cyclical nature of conflict. The torch of civilization is passed down through a line of legendary kings, each adding a new layer to the foundation of human society. King Huang discovers fire by accident, striking a flint against a rock while trying to kill a monstrous serpent, and he teaches his people to honor this divine gift. King Tamuras learns the arts of writing from the demons he has subdued, a powerful metaphor for the idea that wisdom can be wrested even from the forces of darkness. But it is under the reign of the great king Jamshed that civilization reaches its mythical zenith. Jamshed is the Persian Solomon, a king of unparalleled wisdom, power, and glory. For centuries, he reigns over a world free from sickness, death, and want. He teaches humanity how to weave cloth, to forge armor, to build with bricks and mortar. He establishes the different castes of society: priests, warriors, farmers, and artisans. He is the architect of the perfect world, a utopia on earth. His throne, studded with gems, is lifted into the heavens by demons, and from this vantage point, he surveys his flawless creation. But this perfection contains the seed of its own destruction. Gazing upon his own magnificence, Jamshed is overcome with pride. He forgets that his power is a gift from God and begins to see himself as the source of all good. This act of supreme hubris, this forgetting of the divine, is the cardinal sin in Ferdowsi's moral universe. The divine glory, the far abandons him, and his kingdom is plunged into darkness and chaos. The story of Jamshed's fall is a profound and timeless tragedy, a cautionary tale that will resonate through the entire epic. It is Fosse's warning to every king, every sultan, every person who holds power, that pride is the gateway to ruin, that forgetting the source of one's blessings is the surest way to lose them. The kingdom falls under the tyrannical rule of the monstrous user, Zahak, a figure of pure evil, an Arab prince seduced by the whispers of Akman himself. Zahak is a nightmarish figure famous for the 2 black serpents that grow from his shoulders, serpents that must be fed daily on the brains of the kingdom's youth. For 1,000 years, his reign of terror blankets the land. Fear and despair rule. But even in this darkest of nights, a flicker of hope remains. It comes in the form of a humble blacksmith named Cave, whose sons have been taken to feed the tyrant's serpents. In a raw and powerful scene, Cave storms the palace of Zahak, not with an army, but with a cry for justice. He raises his leather blacksmith's apron on a spear, creating a makeshift banner, and calls the people of Iran to rise up against the tyrant. This simple apron, the Dav's Kavani, becomes the sacred banner of Persian resistance, a symbol that the fight for freedom can be started by the humblest of citizens. Cave's call is answered by a young prince of the royal line, Feldon, who leads the rebellion. After a great struggle, Zahak is overthrown, not killed, but imprisoned beneath the volcanic Mount Damaband, chained there until the end of time, a potent symbol that evil can be contained, but perhaps never fully eradicated. Feredun restores justice and divides his kingdom among his 3 sons, an act that, while well-intentioned, leads to the next cycle of tragedy. The envy of the 2 older sons for the youngest, who inherits the heartland of Iran, leads to the first fratricide, a crime that unleashes a torrent of blood feuds and wars that will last for generations. In these opening chapters, Ferdowsi is not merely recounting myths. He is building the philosophical architecture of his world. He is establishing the eternal rhythm of history, a golden age, a fall through pride, a period of darkness and tyranny, and a heroic struggle for restoration and justice. It is a cycle of light and shadow, of order and chaos that will define the destiny of his nation. And it is a pattern he saw repeating itself even in his own time, as the memory of a golden past was threatened by the darkness of forgetting. As the mythical age of creation gives way to the epic age of heroes, the canvas of the Shahnameh explodes with color, action, and raw human emotion. This is the heart of the epic, the grand central narrative that would become the bedrock of Persian identity. It is a world of warrior kings, of epic feuds between the rival nations of Iran and Tan, a world of supernatural wonders, of demons and magical birds, and of deeply human passions, love, loyalty, jealousy, and tragic loss. And at the center of this world, like a great mountain that dominates the landscape, stands a single monumental figure, Rostam. He is the champion of Iran, its protector, its greatest hero. A figure so central and so beloved that he transcends the role of a mere character to become the very embodiment of the nation's soul. Ferdowsi lavishes his greatest poetic powers on the birth and life of this hero. Rostam's birth is itself a legend. His mother Rudbeh is unable to deliver such a colossal infant and is saved only by the intervention of the mythical Siyâvash, a great bird of wisdom who instructs his father, the hero Zal, on how to perform the first cesarean section, an operation that would be known for centuries in Persia as the Rostami birth. From his first moments, Rostam is destined for greatness. He is a giant among men, possessing the strength of 100 elephants, a warrior of immense prowess, yet also a figure of deep loyalty and at times profound sorrow. His life is a series of epic labors and battles in defense of a succession often weak and foolish Kayan kings. He is the unwavering pillar supporting a frequently unstable throne. His story is inextricably linked with that of his legendary steed, Rash, a horse of incredible strength, intelligence, and loyalty. The bond between Rostam and Rash is one of the most moving relationships in the epic, a partnership of warrior and companion that is as deep as any human friendship. Rash is not merely an animal. He is Rostam's other half, his trusted ally in 100 battles, who often saves his master's life through his own cunning and courage. Ferdowsi chronicles Rostam's legendary Haft Khan, or 7 labors, a perilous journey he undertakes to rescue the foolish King Kavus, who has been captured by the demons of Mazandaran. This journey is a masterpiece of mythic storytelling, a veritable odyssey through a landscape of supernatural terror. Rostam battles a monstrous lion while he sleeps, aided by rocks. He crosses a desert of burning sand, survives the seductions of a witch disguised as a beautiful woman, slays a fearsome dragon, and finally confronts and defeats the great white demon Arjang Dev. Each labor is not just a physical contest, but a spiritual and psychological test of his endurance, his cunning, and his unwavering resolve. These are the stories that would be told and retold by every generation of Iranians. The tales that would decorate the walls of palaces and tea houses, the foundational myths of what it meant to be a hero. They are tales of superhuman strength, but also of human vulnerability. Rostam is not a perfect stainless knight. He can be hot-tempered, proud, and sometimes tragically blind to the consequences of his actions. He's a profoundly human hero, and it is this humanity that makes him so enduring. Through Rostam, Ferdowsi is crafting a national ideal. He is the champion his people needed, a symbol of unwavering strength in the face of relentless enemies. A guardian who would always answer the call to defend the land no matter the personal cost. In an age when Persia was ruled by foreign kings and its own martial traditions were fading, the figure of Rostam was a powerful and subversive reminder of a native pre-Islamic heroism. He was a kingmaker, not a king, a servant to the throne, but greater than any man who sat upon it. He represented a kind of pure, untamed Persian spirit, loyal not to a specific ruler, but to the very idea of Iran itself. As Ferdowsi wrote these verses, hunched over his manuscript in his quiet room in Tus, he must have felt the power of what he was doing. He was not just recording old legends, he was forging a god, a national champion who would ride out of the pages of his book and into the hearts of his people. A timeless guardian who would watch over the soul of Persia long after Ferdowsi himself was gone. While the Shahnameh is a chronicle of kings and a celebration of heroes, its deepest and most enduring power lies in its profound exploration of tragedy. Ferdowsi understood that the human condition is defined not just by its triumphs, but by its sorrows, and that the heart is often shaped more by loss than by victory. Within the grand tapestry of his epic, he weaves stories of such heartbreaking pathos that they transcend their mythic setting to become universal meditations on fate, misunderstanding, and the devastating consequences of pride. The most famous and soul-crushing of these is the story of Rostam and his son Sohrab. It is a tale that has been compared to the great tragedies of Sophocles, a story that plumbs the very depths of grief and irony. Rostam, during his youthful travels, has a brief affair with Princess Tamina in a neighboring kingdom. He leaves her with a jewel, instructing her to tie it to the arm of their child, if it is a boy, as a secret sign of his parentage. A son is born, and he grows into a warrior of prodigious strength and skill, a veritable mirror of his father. Driven by a fierce desire to know the father he has never met, Sohrab joins the army of Turan, Iran's great enemy, hoping that the chaos of war will somehow lead him to the legendary Rostam. The armies of Iran and Turan face each other across a plain, and the Turanian king, knowing Sohrab's secret, sends the boy out as his champion, anticipating a climactic duel that will decide the war. Rostam, not knowing the identity of this young, formidable Turanian warrior, rides out to meet him. What follows is a multi-day combat of epic proportions, a clash of two titans who are perfectly matched in strength and courage. They wrestle, they joust, they fight with swords and maces, and each time neither can gain a clear advantage. Rostam, for the first time in his life, feels his strength failing him against this unknown youth. He feels a strange, inexplicable love and admiration for his opponent even as he seeks to defeat him. On the final day of their duel, using a moment of cunning, Rostam finally manages to throw Sohrab to the ground and, in the heat of battle, plunges his dagger into the young warrior's chest. As Sohrab lies dying, he speaks not of hatred, but of his quest to find his father, Rostam, who he knows will avenge his death. He tells his killer, "My father will demand my blood from you." And then, with his last breath, he reveals the jewel tied to his arm. In that moment of horrific recognition, the world collapses for Rostam. The triumphant roar of the Iranian army turns to ash in his mouth. He has killed his own son, the son he had longed for, the one person who could have carried on his heroic lineage. The scene that follows is one of the most powerful depictions of grief in all of world literature. Rostam is consumed by a suicidal despair, a sorrow so immense that it threatens to undo him completely. He has won the battle for Iran, but he has lost his own soul. The story of Rostam and Sohrab is a masterpiece of dramatic irony and a profound commentary on the destructive nature of war, which forces men to see each other only as enemies, blinding them to their shared humanity. It is also a tragedy of identity of a father and son who are kept apart by secrets and the fog of conflict until it is too late. For Ferdowsi's audience, living in a fractured and often war-torn land, it was a story that spoke to the deep wounds of civil strife and the tragedy of a nation divided against itself. It was a reminder that the greatest victories on the battlefield can be the most devastating personal defeats. Through this tale, Ferdy immortalized a fundamental truth that the hero's path is not one of glory alone, but of immense and unbearable suffering. He showed that even the greatest of men, the pillar of the nation, is subject to the cruel whims of fate and the tragic consequences of his own actions. In writing the story of Rostam's greatest sorrow, Ferdy gave his nation its greatest tragedy. A story that would forever serve as a powerful and heartbreaking testament to the profound and terrible cost of conflict. The tragic vein that runs through the Shahnameh is not limited to the battlefield. It extends deep into the perfumed courts and shadowy corridors of royal power. Ferdowsi, drawing from a deep well of Persian folklore and historical memory, presents a world where honor is a fragile treasure, easily shattered by the machinations of the jealous and the ambitious. No story illustrates this more poignantly than the tale of Prince Siyâvash, a narrative that stands as one of the epic's most sophisticated and psychologically complex tragedies. Siyâvash is the very model of a perfect prince. He's handsome, skilled in all the arts of war and peace, and possessed of an unwavering moral purity. He is the beloved son of the often foolish King Siyâvash. The prince's troubles begin within his own father's harem. In a story that echoes the biblical tale of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, the king's beautiful and manipulative wife, Sud, becomes infatuated with her stepson and attempts to seduce him. Siyâvash, horrified, rejects her advances. Enraged and humiliated, Sud accuses the prince of having assaulted her. The king, caught between his love for his son and his passion for his wife, is thrown into turmoil. To prove his innocence, Siyâvash must undergo a trial by fire. In one of the epic's most iconic scenes, he rides his black horse through a mountain of roaring flames. He emerges on the other side completely unscathed, a clear sign of divine judgment in his favor. Though his innocence is proven, the court has been poisoned against him. The relationship with his father is strained, and Siyâvash feels a deep sense of disillusionment with the world of politics and intrigue. Seeking to escape the toxic atmosphere of his father's court, he volunteers to lead an army to the frontier to negotiate a peace with the perennial enemy, Tan. Through his nobility and diplomatic skill, he succeeds in forging a treaty with the wise and honorable king of Tan Arasium. He is welcomed as a guest of honor in the Turanian court, where he finds the respect and admiration that were denied to him at home. He marries Afrasiab's beautiful daughter Ferengis, and the king gives him his own province to rule, a place he names Sivashkot. For a time, it seems that Siyâvash has found a new life, a peaceful kingdom built on honor and mutual respect. He has escaped the corruption of his past. But the serpent of Enri is never far away. The Turanian courtiers, led by the wicked Garcia, grow jealous of the Persian prince's influence and favor with their king. They begin to poison Afrasiab's mind with lies and rumors, suggesting that Siyâvash is building an army to overthrow him. Afrasi, his mind clouded by suspicion, eventually turns against his son-in-law. The tragedy that unfolds is slow, deliberate, and agonizing. Siyâvash, knowing he is innocent, but seeing that he is doomed, refuses to flee or to raise his hand against his father-in-law, to whom he has sworn an oath of loyalty. He chooses to face his unjust fate with a stoic and heartbreaking dignity. He is captured and, in a brutal and sacrilegious act, is dragged to a desolate basin and executed. His innocent blood spilling onto the barren earth. The murder of Siyâvash is not just a personal tragedy. It is a cosmic crime, an act that stains the world and unleashes a new and terrible cycle of vengeance. From the spot where his blood falls, a plant with a single beautiful flower is said to have grown, a perennial symbol of his innocence. His death ignites a great war of revenge led by Iran, which will last for generations and consume countless lives. The story of Siyâvash is Fauci's masterful exploration of political intrigue and the tragic fate of the truly honorable man in a world of lies. Siyâvash is a Christ-like figure, a martyr to his own purity. He is a man who at every turn makes the right and honorable choice and yet is relentlessly destroyed by the envy and wickedness of those around him. For Fauci's audience of douans, the old Persian nobility who often found themselves navigating the treacherous politics of foreign Turkic or Arab courts, the story of Siyâvash was deeply resonant. It spoke to their own precarious position, their own struggle to maintain a sense of Persian honor and integrity while serving rulers they often distrusted. It was a story about the fragility of goodness, about the way that suspicion can corrode even the strongest bonds of love and loyalty. And it served as a powerful reminder that the greatest tragedies are often not the result of a single evil act, but of a slow, creeping poison of whispers, lies, and doubt that can turn a paradise into a wasteland and a beloved friend into a deadly enemy. As Fauci's pen moves through the centuries, the mists of pure mythology begin to recede, giving way to the hazy light of semi-legendary history. The narrative transitions from the age of epic heroes to the era of historical kings, culminating in the rise of the last great native Persian dynasty, the Sasanians. While this section of the Shahnameh is grounded more in historical chronicles, Ferdowsi's approach remains that of a poet, not a historian. He is not interested in a dry recitation of dates and events. He is seeking the moral and epic truth within the historical record. His goal is to connect the Persia of his own time to its imperial past, to show his readers that the glories he has been describing are not just the stuff of ancient myth, but are part of a continuous living tradition that flows directly to them. The Sasanian portion of the epic begins with Ardashir I, the founder of the dynasty who overthrew the Parthians and consciously set about to restore the glory of the ancient Achaemenid Empire. Ferdowsi portrays Ardashir not just as a conqueror, but as a great restorer of order and a champion of Persian identity. He is the unifier who rekindles the sacred fires of Zoroastrianism and re-establishes the proper rights of kingship after centuries of foreign Hellenistic and Parthian rule. He is the figure who bridges the long gap in the narrative linking the legendary past to a verifiable historical reality. The reigns of the great Sasanian monarchs are presented as a series of moral exemplars. Shapur the Great, who famously captured the Roman Emperor Valerian, is depicted as a model of a just and powerful king. Bahamgur is the archetypal hunter-king, a figure of immense vigor and romantic adventure, whose life is filled with tales of hunting lions and wild asses and of encounters with beautiful princesses in disguise. But it is the reign of Khosrow, known as Anushirwan, the immortal soul, that Ferdoy holds up as the ultimate ideal of a just and wise ruler. Khosrow Anushirwan is the philosopher king, the Persian Marcus Aurelius. His court is a center of learning and justice, a place where scholars from Greece and India are welcomed. Ferdowsi recounts numerous anecdotes illustrating Crow's wisdom and his unwavering commitment to justice for the common man. In one famous story, the king is building a new palace and an old woman refuses to sell her small plot of land that had joins the site. The king's advisors urge him to take the land by force, but Khosrow refuses, ordering that the palace be built around the old woman's house, leaving it standing as a testament that the king's power is not absolute and that the rights of the humblest subject must be respected. The crooked wall of the palace becomes a permanent symbol of the straightness of the king's justice. Through these stories, Ferdowsi is creating a mirror for princes, a guide to just rulership for the sultans and emirs of his own day. He is implicitly contrasting the wisdom and justice of these native Persian kings with the often arbitrary and brutal rule of the foreign dynasties of his time. He is reminding them of the Persian ideal of kingship, an ideal based on justice, dad, wisdom, kerad, and a sacred duty to protect the people. But as with all things in the Shahnameh, this golden age is destined to fall. The final chapters of the epic chronicle the decline of the Sasanian dynasty, weakened by internal strife and disastrous wars with the Byzantine Empire. The narrative takes on a deeply somber and elegiac tone as it approaches the inevitable catastrophe. The final Sasanian king, Yazda III, is a tragic and doomed figure, a young and inexperienced ruler who inherits a crumbling empire on the brink of invasion. The sense of impending doom is palpable. Ferdoy masterfully builds the suspense and the farce, leading his readers towards the moment that has haunted the Persian imagination for centuries, the Arab conquest. He recounts the story of the pivotal Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, not from the perspective of a triumphant new faith, but from the perspective of the vanquished. He gives voice to the despair and disbelief of the Persian commanders as their ancient and glorious army is defeated by a force they had underestimated. The most poignant and powerful passage in this section is a long prophetic letter written on the eve of the final battle by the Persian general Rostam Farukad, a historical figure not to be confused with the mythical hero Rostam. In this letter, the general laments the coming darkness. He predicts that the throne of the Shah will be overthrown, that the customs of Iran will be replaced by those of the desert, that men will turn to greed and falsehood, and that the long, glorious day of Persia is setting into an endless night. It is a heartbreaking lament for a lost world, a cry of anguish that echoes across the centuries. In this moment, the voice of the Sasanian general and the voice of the poet Ferdowsi merge into one. Ferdowsi is not just recounting the end of a dynasty, he is mourning the fall of his own civilization, the very event that created the broken world he inherited. The epic that began with the creation of the world ends with the destruction of his world, bringing the reader full circle. The final verses of the Shan are a testament to the poet's courage. In an age when praising the Islamic conquest was the only safe political and religious position, Ferdowsi dared to tell the story from the other side. He gave voice to the sorrow, the dignity, and the tragedy of the vanquished, ensuring that their memory would not be erased by the victor's narrative. He ended his great epic not with a celebration, but with a tear, a final loving tribute to the lost world he had so painstakingly resurrected in his 60,000 verses. For 3 decades, the Shahnameh was Ferdowsi's entire world. While dynasties rose and fell outside his window, while the currents of political power shifted and the map of his world was redrawn, his own life was governed by a different calendar, a different rhythm. It was a rhythm dictated by the steady scratching of his pen on parchment, by the metronomic cadence of rhyming couplets, by the rising and setting of suns that marked not the passage of his own days, but the passage of centuries in the life of his nation. This was not the romantic work of a court poet dashing off elegant verses in a perfumed garden. This was hard, relentless, solitary labor, a self-imposed exile from the world of the living into the world of ghosts and echoes. To undertake such a monumental task required a sacrifice that is difficult to comprehend in our modern age. It was a sacrifice of time, of companionship, of life's simple pleasures. But most tangible of all, it was a sacrifice of wealth. The creation of a book like the Shahnameh was an enormously expensive enterprise. The parchment alone, requiring the skins of hundreds of animals, would have cost a fortune. The inks had to be sourced and prepared. Scribes may have been needed to create fair copies. And most importantly, the sources themselves, the old and rare prose chronicles, had to be purchased often at great cost from collectors or from the libraries of wealthy patrons. Ferdowsi, a man of the land-owning Dahakan class, was not fabulously wealthy, but he was comfortable. He had inherited enough land to live a life of leisure. Over the course of 30 years, he systematically liquidated his inheritance, pouring his own fortune into the creation of his masterpiece. He sold his lands piece by piece to buy the fuel for his creative fire. He was, in essence, transmuting his ancestral soil into the immortal pages of his book. There is a profound symbolism in this act. He was trading the tangible physical inheritance of his family for an intangible spiritual inheritance for his entire people. He was converting his own personal past into the collective memory of his nation. This long, slow process of self-impoverishment was also a process of isolation. The work demanded a monk-like devotion. Days would have been spent cross-referencing sources, wrestling with a difficult turn of phrase, searching for the perfect rhyme that would not only fit the meter, but would also deepen the meaning of the verse. Nights would have been spent with his mind still churning, living inside the world he was creating, walking with Rostam on his perilous journey, weeping with Pharangies over the body of Siyâvash, standing with the last Sasanian king as his empire crumbled. Such an obsession inevitably builds a war between a person and the ordinary world. While his neighbors were concerned with harvests and local politics, Ferdowsi was concerned with the fate of mythical kings. His dedication was likely seen by many as a strange and foolish obsession. The quixotic quest of a man squandering his wealth on a book of old pagan tales in an age that had ostensibly moved on. We can imagine the scene, the aging poet, his back bent, his eyes strained from decades of reading and writing by oil lamp, his fingers stained with ink. His own life is draining away, his hair turning the color of snow, his hands beginning to tremble. But as his physical body weakens, the world he is building grows stronger and more vibrant with each passing day. He is like a master architect overseeing the construction of a great cathedral, knowing he will not live to see it fully completed in all its glory, but driven by the faith that it will stand for 1,000 years. He was not just writing a book. He was performing a sacred rite. He was a chronicler, but he was also a shaman, a necromancer who was calling forth the spirits of the dead and giving them voice. He was painstakingly weaving a great shroud, a burial cloth made of words to honor and protect the body of his dying culture. But it was also a seed bank, a vessel containing the vital essence of that culture, which could one day be replanted and brought back to life. The 30 years of labor were an act of profound faith. There was no guarantee of success. The finished work might have been ignored, dismissed, or even destroyed. He had no powerful patron to protect him, no royal commission to fund him. He was sustained only by his own unwavering belief in the importance of his mission. He was answering a call from the past, a whisper from the generations of his ancestors, and he was determined to provide an answer that would echo into the far future. The sacrifice was total. He gave his book his time, his wealth, and his life. And in return, the book gave him immortality. After 30 years of relentless labor, the moment of completion finally arrived. Around the year 1010, the old poet in his study in Tus wrote the final couplet of his monumental work. The Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, was finished. 60,000 verses, a chronicle of 50 reigns, a labor of a lifetime, lay complete before him. But the completion of the work was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a new and perilous one. A book of this magnitude could not simply be published and distributed. To ensure its survival and dissemination, it needed a powerful patron, a royal seal of approval that would elevate it from a private obsession to a national treasure. And in the world of 11th century Persia, there was only one power significant enough to fulfill that role: Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni. The decision to present the Shahnameh to Mahmud was a logical one, but it was fraught with danger and deep tragic irony. Mahmud was the most powerful ruler of his time, a man whose empire stretched from the borders of India to the heart of Persia. A dedication from him would guarantee the book's fame and preservation. Yet Mahmud was everything the heroes of the Shahnameh were not. He was a Turk, not a Persian. He was a zealous Sunni Muslim with little patience for the Zoroastrian mythology that filled the pages of the epic. He was a pragmatic and often ruthless conqueror, a man of the sword, not a man of ancient lineage or epic ideals. There was a fundamental clash of worldviews, a deep cultural chasm that separated the poet from the Sultan. Nevertheless, Ferdowsi, now an old man, undertook the arduous journey from his home in Tus to the magnificent Ghaznavid court in what is now modern-day Afghanistan. We must imagine the scene, a moment thick with historical weight. The aging poet, a living link to Persia's ancient past, stands before the throne of the new master of the East. He carries with him not a tribute of gold or jewels, but a tribute of memory, a world bound in leather, the distilled soul of the very people the Sultan now ruled. The legends surrounding this encounter are many, and they form a crucial part of Ferdowsi's own story. It is said that at first, Mahmud was impressed. He had other Persian poets at his court, and he appreciated the power of verse to glorify his reign. Ferdowsi, according to some accounts, recited passages from his work. Perhaps the thrilling tales of Rostam's battles, which would have appealed to the Sultan's martial spirit. The story goes that Mahmud, impressed by the sheer scale of the work, promised the poet a gold dinar for every couplet. 60,000 gold coins, a truly royal sum that would have restored Ferdowsi's fortune and rewarded him for his life sacrifice. But the initial enthusiasm soon soured. The Sultan's courtiers, perhaps jealous of this newcomer, began to poison their master's mind. They whispered that the book was filled with praise for infidel kings and pagan heroes. They pointed out that its hero, Rostam, was a far more compelling figure than any of the Sultan's own ancestors. Most damningly, they likely accused Ferdowsi of being a Shia sympathizer, a heretical charge in the fiercely Sunni court of Mahmud. The Sultan, a man known for his religious zeal and his volatile temper, began to have second thoughts. When the time came for payment, the promised 60,000 gold coins did not arrive. Instead, a caravan delivered 60,000 silver dirhams, a fraction of the promised value, an amount that was not a reward, but an insult. It was a gesture of profound contempt, a dismissal of 30 years of labor, a statement that the epic history of Persia was worth little more than common silver in the eyes of its new ruler. The moment of betrayal was absolute for Ferdowsi. This was not just about the money. He had spent his own fortune on the book and was not a man driven by greed. It was about the lack of recognition, the failure of the king to understand the value of what he had been given. It was the ultimate rejection of his life's work by the one man whose approval could have secured its place in the world. The poet who had chronicled the betrayals of ancient kings now felt the sting of a modern one. The man who had given a voice to a nation was now left speechless by the deafness of its ruler. The grand and heroic world of the shame had collided with the petty and cynical reality of court politics, and the result was a deep and bitter disillusionment. The insult of the silver coins was more than just a broken promise. It was a spark thrown upon the dry tinder of a proud and weary soul. The reaction of Ferdowsi, as immortalized in legend, was not one of subservient disappointment, but of towering, defiant rage. This was the moment the quiet scholar, the patient chronicler of history, became a hero in his own right. A man who would use his only weapon, his voice, to speak truth to power regardless of the consequences. The story, which has the burnished quality of a foundational myth, is told with relish. Upon receiving the sacks of silver, Ferdowsi did not even count them. He walked from the palace to a nearby bathhouse, and in a gesture of magnificent contempt, he divided the entire sum in two. He gave one half to the bathhouse keeper and the other half to a street vendor selling refreshments. He treated the king's royal payment as little more than loose change, a tip for common laborers. The message was unmistakable and utterly audacious. A king's word, when broken, is worthless, and his treasure, when given in bad faith, is nothing but dross. This act of public defiance was tantamount to a death sentence. To so openly humiliate a ruler as powerful and as notoriously ill-tempered as Sultan Mahmud was, an act of incredible, almost suicidal courage. Ferdowsi knew he could not remain in Ghazni. He fled the city under the cover of darkness, becoming a fugitive and an exile, an old man on the run from the most powerful monarch of his age. But his defiance was not finished. His most powerful act of revenge was yet to come. As he traveled, seeking refuge in the courts of other lesser rulers, he composed a new piece of work. It was not an epic of kings, but a satire, a scathing, venomous invective directed at Sultan Mahmud himself. This satire, which was for a time appended to the preface of the Shahnameh, is a masterpiece of righteous fury. In it, Ferdowsi mocks the Sultan's lowly origins, contrasting his slave ancestry with the noble lineage of the Persian kings celebrated in the epic. He decries the Sultan's lack of culture, his greed, and his broken promises. He pours all of his bitterness and disillusionment into verses that are as sharp and as deadly as a dagger. He asks, "Had the king's mother been a princess, he would have placed a golden crown on my head. But as he is the son of a slave, he could not value my art." It was a devastating and deeply personal attack, a poet's curse upon a king. This act reveals the core of Ferdowsi's character. He was a man who had spent his life in the company of epic heroes, and in his moment of trial, he behaved like one. He valued his honor, his name above all else, above wealth, above comfort, and even above his own life. The Sultan had insulted his work, and by extension, he had insulted the memory of Persia itself. For Ferdowsi, this was a crime that could not be left unanswered. He was Rostam standing alone against a foolish and unjust king. He was Cave, the blacksmith raising the banner of defiance against a tyrant. His flight into exile was a painful and ignominious end to his quest for patronage. He wandered for years, an old and impoverished man seeking protection from Mahmud's wrath. But, in a deeper sense, this final act of defiance was the only fitting conclusion to his life story. It was the moment he stepped out from behind the curtain of his own epic and took his place on the stage alongside the heroes he had immortalized. He had shown that the spirit of defiant honor that he had so lovingly chronicled in the Shahnameh was not just a relic of a bygone age. It was a living fire that could still burn in the heart of a Persian poet. The Sultan had his armies, his wealth, and his power. But Ferdowsi had his voice, and he had used it to deliver a wound to the king's legacy that would never fully heal. The story of the poet's curse would be told and retold for centuries, a timeless reminder that the power of a just word can sometimes be greater and more enduring than the power of a king's sword. The final years of Ferdowsi's life are shrouded in the midst of poignant legend, a fittingly tragic and beautiful epilogue to a life lived in service to an epic past. After fleeing the wrath of Sultan Mahmud, the aged poet became a wanderer. He was a king of words with no kingdom, a man who had built a monument for his nation but had no home for himself. He sought refuge in the courts of various local rulers, but none were powerful enough to offer him permanent protection from the long reach of the Ghaznavid Sultan. Eventually, broken by age, poverty, and disillusionment, he made his way back to his beloved hometown of Tus, the place where his long journey had begun. He returned not as a celebrated national poet, but as a fugitive, living out his final days in obscurity and seclusion, perhaps finding his only solace in the familiar landscapes that had first inspired him. He died around the year 1020, an old man whose great work had seemingly been rejected by the powerful and forgotten by the world. But the story does not end there. History, like poetry, has a deep sense of irony. The most enduring legend associated with Ferdowsi's death is that of Sultan Mahmud's remorse. The tale recounts that years later, the Sultan was in the midst of a campaign when one of his courtiers quoted a powerful verse from the Shahnameh to sway him towards a merciful decision. Struck by the wisdom and beauty of the line, Mahmud asked who had written it. When he was reminded that it was from the great epic by the poet from Tus, whom he had so poorly rewarded, he was overcome with a wave of guilt and regret. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He recognized the immense value of the gift he had been given and the shabby injustice of his response. Seeking to make amends, he ordered that the promised 60,000 gold dinars be sent to Ferdowsi in Tus at once, along with his royal apologies. A great caravan laden with treasure was dispatched from the capital. It made its way across the plains and mountains to the distant city of Tus, and here the legend delivers its most heartbreaking and cinematic twist. As the royal caravan, with its banners flying and its camels laden with gold, entered the city through one gate, another, much humbler procession was exiting through the opposite gate. It was the funeral cortege of the Port Ferdowsi, a small group of family and friends carrying his body to its final resting place. The king's reward had arrived, but it was a lifetime too late. The tragedy is compounded by one final insult. The local Sunni cleric in Tus, a man of rigid orthodoxy, refused to allow Ferdowsi to be buried in the main Muslim cemetery. He declared that the poet who had spent his life glorifying pagan kings and Zoroastrian heroes was a heretic and unworthy of being laid to rest in consecrated ground. This final act of posthumous rejection by the religious establishment was the ultimate symbol of the conflict that had defined Ferdowsi's life. The struggle between a narrow dogmatic present and a vast inclusive vision of his nation's past. And so the man who had built a timeless home for the soul of Persia was denied a simple plot of earth in his own hometown. He was buried not among the righteous, but in the family orchard, a quiet plot of land within the walls of his own garden. It was a humble end for a man of such monumental achievement. And yet, there is a profound and beautiful justice in it. He was laid to rest in his own soil, the very earth of Khorasan that he loved and whose stories he had told. He was buried among the trees that he himself had planted. A poet returned to the land that had nourished his art. His final resting place was not a monument built by a king, but a simple garden, a place of natural beauty and quiet contemplation. It was a tomb that symbolized the very essence of his work, a legacy that grew not from the patronage of the powerful, but from the native soil of his own culture, a voice that was ultimately independent of any king or cleric, a quiet and enduring presence that would outlast them all. The caravan of gold, it is said, was given to his daughter, who, in a final act of filial piety and defiant pride, refused to accept the blood money that had come too late for her father. Instead, she used it to repair a local caravanserai, a rest stop for travelers, turning the symbol of a king's failed promise into a lasting monument of public service. The secret legacy of Ferdowsi is not that he wrote a book, but that he performed a miracle of cultural resurrection. His true accomplishment was not the 60,000 verses themselves, but the world they saved from oblivion. When Ferdowsi began his work, the Persian language was in retreat, and the collective memory of pre-Islamic Iran was a scattered and fading mosaic. By the time he laid down his pen 30 years later, he had not just preserved that memory, he had reforged it, giving it a definitive, powerful, and utterly intoxicating voice that would echo for 1,000 years. The Shahnameh did more than just save a collection of stories. It saved the very soul of a language. In an age when Arabic was the dominant language of power and prestige, Ferdowsi made a conscious and radical choice. He chose to write his epic in a pure and muscular Persian, deliberately avoiding the ornate Arabic loanwords that were fashionable in the court poetry of his day. He reached back into the deep linguistic soil of his homeland, seeking out old and potent words, crafting a style that was both timeless and accessible. The result was a book that became the cornerstone of modern Persian. It acted as a linguistic anchor, a standard of clarity and beauty that all future generations of Persian writers would look to. By giving the language such a monumental work of art, he ensured its survival and prestige. He proved that Persian was not just a vernacular tongue, but a language capable of expressing the highest peaks of epic poetry and the deepest valleys of human emotion. He built a fortress for his language, and within its walls, Persian literature would flourish for centuries to come. But the legacy is deeper than linguistics. The Shahnameh became the central pillar of Iranian identity. It provided a continuous narrative that connected the Persian people of the Islamic era to their ancient, glorious, and non-Arab past. It gave them a pantheon of heroes: Rostam, Siyâvash, Esfandiar, who were uniquely their own. It gave them a foundational mythology, a shared set of values, a common frame of reference. To be Persian after Ferdowsi was to know the stories of the Shahnameh. It was to understand the tragedy of Sorab, to admire the justice of Bush Shirvan, to feel a surge of pride and the defiance of Cave. The book became a unifying force in a politically fragmented world. No matter who ruled in Isfahan, Shiraz, or Herat, whether they were Turks, Mongols, or Afghans, the Shahnameh remained the undisputed national epic, a constant and powerful reminder of a shared Persian cultural heritage that transcended politics and dynasties. Its influence permeated every aspect of Persian culture. The stories were not confined to the page. They became the subject of countless miniature paintings, creating one of the world's most sophisticated traditions of manuscript illustration. They were depicted on pottery, metalwork, and textiles. Storytellers called knuckles would recite the verses in coffee houses, holding audiences spellbound with the tales of ancient heroes, a tradition that continued into the 20th century. The Shahnameh was not a dusty classic sitting on a shelf. It was a living, breathing part of the nation's daily life. And perhaps most secretly, it was a subtle but persistent form of resistance. By celebrating a pre-Islamic past, by lionizing Zoroastrian heroes, and by telling the story of the Arab conquest from a Persian perspective, the Shahnameh offered a powerful counter-narrative to the dominant culture of the Caliphate and its successor states. It was a declaration that even though Persia had been conquered and had converted to Islam, it had not been culturally assimilated. It had retained its own unique soul, its own distinct history, its own proud and ancient voice. This is the ultimate paradox and the greatest triumph of Ferdowsi's legacy. The man who died in poverty and obscurity, who was denied a proper burial by the religious authorities of his day, became the single most important figure in the preservation of his culture. The book that was scorned by a powerful sultan became the book that would define a nation. The voice that was almost silenced by the march of history became the eternal echo of Iran, a testament to the incredible power of a single individual armed with nothing but love for his heritage to stand against the tide of forgetting and through a lifetime of sacrifice ensure that the soul of his nation would never be lost. The garden in Tus that holds his remains is now a grand mausoleum, a site of national pilgrimage. The humble poet from the provinces is now revered as the father of his nation's literature, the guardian of its identity. The secret is out. The lost voice was never truly lost. It was just waiting in the 60,000 verses of a quiet and determined man to be heard again. And so we stand at the threshold of the poet's garden at what feels like the end of a story, but is in fact the beginning of an echo that continues to reverberate through the centuries. The legacy of Ferdowsi is a profound testament to the paradox of power. The great Sultan Mahmud, the conqueror of India, the man whose name struck fear into the hearts of kings, is now largely a figure for historians. His empire, long since turned to dust, his conquests footnotes in the annals of time. But the poor poet he scorned, the old man he sent into exile, is alive. He lives every time a child in Tehran or Kabul or Dukhan hears the story of Rostam and Rash for the first time. He lives in the sublime brushstrokes of the miniature painters who brought his verses to vibrant life. He lives in the cadence and rhythm of the Persian language itself, a language that bears the indelible imprint of his genius. He lives in the very idea of Iran, a nation whose modern identity is inextricably woven from the threads of his epic tapestry. The Shahnameh is more than a book. It is a river of memory that flows through 1,000 years of Persian history. It has nourished the roots of countless other works of art and literature. Poets like Hayes and Sadi, who are more famous in the West, drank deeply from its waters. Mystics and philosophers found in its tales profound allegories for the journey of the soul. Even in times of national crisis and foreign invasion, the Persian people have turned to the Shahnameh for solace and inspiration, for a reminder of their own resilience, for the story of a people who have faced darkness and destruction time and again and have always endured. It taught them that true kingship is defined by justice, not by power. That true heroism is found in duty and sacrifice, not in conquest, and that honor is a treasure more precious than any crown. Ferdowsi's work is a powerful reminder that the victors do not always get to write the final version of history. He took the narrative of his people's greatest defeat, the Sasanian collapse, and transformed it not into a story of shame, but into a noble tragedy. A tale of a great civilization that fell not because it was weak, but because it was betrayed by fate. He gave his people a way to understand their own history, that preserved their dignity and honored their ancestors. This is the ultimate power of the storyteller. They can take the raw, brutal facts of history, the battles, the conquests, the betrayals, and weave them into a narrative that gives them meaning. A story that can heal the wounds of a nation and shape its destiny. Ferdowsi was the ultimate master of this art. He was a historian of the heart, a poet who understood that the soul of a people resides not in its monuments of stone, but in its monuments of words. The secret legacy of Ferdowsi is the enduring truth that a civilization is not truly conquered until its stories are silenced. And his great gift to his people and to the world was to ensure that the voice of Persia would never fall silent. It remains a voice of epic grandeur, of profound sorrow, and of indomitable spirit. It is a voice that speaks of the timeless struggle between light and dark, a voice that celebrates the flawed but magnificent pageant of humanity, a voice that once heard can never be forgotten. It is the lost voice that was found, the quiet whisperer that became an eternal roar, the lasting testament of the humble poet from Tus, who in saving the stories of his land became the greatest hero of them all. The final echo from the garden is one of quiet triumph. The rustle of wind in the cypress trees, a sound like the turning of a billion pages carrying the immortal verses of the King of Words. There is a purity that some souls carry into the world, a light so brilliant and so unwavering that it cannot help but cast shadows of envy and suspicion in the hearts of lesser men. It is a tragic and eternal paradox that the most profound integrity often inspires the most profound corruption in others, that a spirit of absolute honor can become a target in a world governed by compromise and deceit. This is a story about such a soul, a prince whose virtue was as legendary as his beauty, a man who became a martyr, not for a faith or for a crown, but for the very idea of his own unshakable honor. It is a tale that lies at the tragic heart of a great national epic, a story that serves as a timeless meditation on the fate of goodness in a world of political intrigue, a world of flawed kings, jealous courtiers, and the consuming passions that can turn a palace into a prison and a sanctuary into a tomb. This is not a story of a triumphant hero who vanquishes his enemies and wins his kingdom. It is the story of a hero who at every turn makes the right, the just, and the honorable choice, and is for that very reason relentlessly and inexorably destroyed. Before we journey into this epic tragedy, join us in preserving these foundational stories of humanity. Affirm your place in this circle of seekers by liking this video and subscribing to our channel so that these timeless tales of virtue and sacrifice may continue to illuminate our present. We must travel now into the mythological heart of Persia, into the pages of the great Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. We must enter the court of a king whose greatness was forever undermined by his own foolishness and vanity, a court saturated with wealth and power but poisoned by intrigue. In this world of eternal conflict between the noble land of Iran and its perennial enemy, Turan, a child of destiny is born. He is the son of the impetuous and often reckless king, Kavus. But this Prince Siyâvash seems to be forged from a different, purer element than his father. From his first moments, he is marked by a profound and almost otherworldly grace. Fearing that the corrupting influence of the royal court would taint the boy's perfect nature, the king makes his wisest decision. He entrusts the education of his son not to the sycophants and political schemers of the palace, but to the greatest hero the land has ever known, the champion Rostam. The legendary warrior takes the young prince away from the world of men to his own remote domain, a place of mountains and wilderness where the air is clean and the soul can grow straight and true like a cypress tree. For years, Siyâvash is raised under the tutelage of this paragon of heroism. From Rostam, he learns not just the arts of war, how to ride a horse so it becomes an extension of his own body, how to wield a sword and a lance, how to command men in battle. But more importantly, he learns the deeper arts of peace. He learns the meaning of justice, the sacredness of an oath, the importance of humility, and the unshakable value of one's own word. He grows into a young man of unparalleled skill and even greater character. He is handsome beyond compare, a physical manifestation of the inner beauty of his soul. He is a warrior with no equal, but a spirit that longs for peace. He is a prince who carries himself with the quiet dignity of a philosopher. In him, all the heroic virtues of his nation find their perfect expression. When he has learned all that Rostam can teach him, the time comes for him to return to his father's world, to take his place as the heir to the throne. His return to the capital is a moment of great celebration. The people look upon him with awe, seeing in him the promise of a golden age. King Kavus himself is overcome with pride and love for this perfect son, a son who is everything he is not. But the return of a bright light into a shadowy world is not without its perils. For in the heart of the palace, in the queen's chambers, a dangerous obsession is beginning to take root. A passion that will set in motion a chain of events so tragic, so devastating, that it will stain the annals of the kingdom with innocent blood and ignite a war of vengeance that will consume generations. The young prince had returned not just as a hero, but as an ideal made manifest. And in the treacherous world of the court, nothing is more dangerous than an ideal. The The court of Kaikavus was a world built on shifting sands, a place of immense power that was perpetually destabilized by the whims and passions of its ruler. And no passion held the king more captive than his love for his beautiful and manipulative queen, Shahnameh. She was a woman of intoxicating charm and a will of iron, accustomed to getting whatever she desired, and her gaze soon fell upon the paragon of virtue who was her stepson, Siyâvash. In the prince's flawless form and noble bearing, she saw not a son to be respected, but a prize to be conquered. Her admiration curdled into an illicit and consuming desire, an obsession that saw his virtue not as a barrier, but as a challenge. She began to devise a plan, a web of sweet words and cunning pretexts to lure him into her grasp, to draw him from the world of light and honor into her own world of shadow and secret desires. Her first move was one of subtle manipulation. She went to her husband, the king, and feigned a motherly concern, suggesting that it was time for the noble prince to be married and that he should visit the royal harem to inspect the princesses and choose a wife. It was a request that, on its surface, seemed proper, a queen's duty to see the royal wine secured. The unsuspecting king readily agreed, commanding his son to attend his stepmother and heed her counsel in this important matter. Siyâvash, whose very nature was one of obedience and respect for his father, could not refuse the royal command. Yet, a deep sense of unease settled in his heart. His pure spirit, attuned to the subtle currents of the soul, could sense a dissonance in the queen's intentions, a melody that was beautiful on the surface, but held a discordant and dangerous undertone. He went to the queen's opulent chambers, a world of silk and perfume, and greeted her with the formal respect due to his father's wife. Shahnameh received him with a disarming warmth, treating him with a familiarity that bordered on the intimate. She praised his strength, his skill, his reputation, her words like honeyed wine. She then led him into the private gardens of the harem, unveiling the candidates for his hand, the noble ladies and princesses of the court. But as she presented them, she would subtly disparage each one, finding a small flaw, a minor imperfection, a message clear none of them were worthy of him. After this parade of curated imperfection, she turned her full, focused attention on Siyâvash, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She declared that she herself would be his guide, his confidant, his closest ally in the court, that she would love him more fiercely than any of these lesser women, more than his own father. It was a declaration that teetered on the edge of propriety, a confession veiled in the language of maternal affection, but charged with the electricity of a far more dangerous passion. Siyâvash, deeply uncomfortable, felt the trap beginning to close. He understood the true nature of the game being played. With a wisdom beyond his years, he deflected her advances with a shield of perfect courtesy. He thanked her for her counsel, bowed deeply, and made his excuses, extricating himself from her presence before the implicit could become explicit. He left her chambers with his honor intact, but his heart heavy with a terrible premonition. He had navigated the first test, sidestepped the first snare, but he knew with a chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. The queen, a woman unaccustomed to denial, would not be so easily deterred. Her desire, now rebuffed, would not simply fade. It would fester, growing stronger, more reckless, and infinitely more dangerous. The serpent of obsession had been awakened in the heart of the palace, and Siyâvash knew that its gaze was fixed solely on him. The quiet refusal of the prince did not extinguish the queen's illicit fire. It fanned the flames into a raging inferno. Shahnameh, consumed by a mixture of desire and wounded pride, was driven to an act of greater recklessness. She resolved that she would not be denied. She went to King Kavus once more, this time with a performance of calculated theatricality. She wept, she lamented, she tore at her clothes, accusing her innocent stepson of insolence, of scorning her motherly affection and refusing her counsel. She claimed he was growing arrogant and that only she could guide him. She begged the king to send Siyâvash to her private palace for a feast, where she, as his loving mother, could personally counsel him and mend the imagined rift. The king, ever susceptible to his wife's dramatic displays, was easily swayed. He saw not a predator setting a trap, but a caring mother attempting to connect with a recalcitrant son. He summoned Siyâvash and, for the second time, commanded him to attend the queen. Siyâvash's heart grew cold. He knew the peril that awaited him, but to refuse a direct order from his king and father would be an act of open rebellion, an unthinkable stain on his honor. Trapped by his own virtue, he had no choice but to obey. With a heavy heart, he went to her palace, his mind on high alert, his soul armored in prayer. This time, Sudabé dispensed with all pretense. She led him to a throne, sat beside him, and spoke to him not as a mother, but as a would-be lover. She touched his arm, praised his physical beauty with unveiled admiration, and finally, she made her desire explicit. She offered him everything: her love, her body, her influence, the keys to the kingdom's treasury, the command of the army, even the throne itself, if he would only be hers. It was the ultimate temptation, an offer of absolute power and sensual pleasure. For any other man, it might have been irresistible. But Siyâvash was not any other man. He was horrified. His entire being recoiled from her proposition. It was a betrayal of his father, a violation of the sacred laws of hospitality and family, a stain on the very fabric of honor that constituted his soul. He stood up, his face a mask of cold fury and disbelief. He rebuked her sharply, reminding her of her duty to his father and God. He told her that he would rather face death than dishonor, that her beauty was a demonic trap, and that she should repent for her wicked thoughts. He turned his back on her and walked away, leaving her alone in her opulent chamber, surrounded by the ruin of her fantasy. The sting of his rejection, the shame of his righteous judgment, was more than her proud spirit could bear. In that instant, her obsessive love transformed into its twisted mirror image, a venomous, all-consuming hatred. If she could not possess him, she would destroy him. As he left, she let out a piercing scream. She tore her own silken robes, raked her fingernails across her face and arms, and began to cry out for help. Guards and servants rushed in to find a scene of carefully orchestrated chaos, the queen in disarray, weeping hysterically, and the prince nowhere to be seen. The trap had been sprung. With a voice choked with feigned terror and real fury, she unleashed the lie that would seal his fate. She accused the prince of the very crime she had intended to commit. She claimed that he, her pure and noble stepson, had entered her chambers, been overcome with a savage lust, and had attempted to assault her, to take her by force. The accusation, as monstrous as it was baseless, echoed through the palace, a poisoned dagger aimed at the heart of the most honorable man in the kingdom. The court, a place that thrived on rumor and scandal, was immediately set ablaze. The lie, born of a moment of vengeful fury, now took on a life of its own, threatening to consume the innocent prince in its infernal flames. The monstrous accusation against Siyâvash sent a shockwave through the kingdom, and at its epicenter was the throne of the king himself. Kaikavus was thrown into a torment of indecision, a storm raging within his soul that pitted his two greatest loves against each other. On one side was his son, the physical embodiment of all his hopes for the future, a young man whose impeccable character he had witnessed and admired. Siyâvash's virtue was not a matter of speculation. It was a known quantity, a truth as solid and as luminous as a diamond. On the other side was his wife, Sudabé, the object of his deepest and most blinding passion, a woman whose beauty had bewitched him and whose influence over him was nearly absolute. He was a king trapped not between truth and falsehood, but between two competing affections, and his judgment was hopelessly clouded by his own emotional weakness. He summoned Siyâvash, who stood before him with the calm and quiet dignity that never left him. The prince did not protest his innocence with loud declarations. He simply told the truth, recounting the queen's advances and his own rejection of them. His words were measured, his gaze was steady, and his account had the simple, unadorned ring of fact. Then Kavus summoned his queen. Sudabé entered the throne room and delivered the performance of her life. Weeping, her face and arms bearing the scratches she had inflicted upon herself, she retold her fabricated story of assault with such convincing passion, such theatrical despair, that it could sway any heart not firmly anchored in reason. Siyâvash was torn asunder. He looked at his son's honest face and believed him. He looked at his wife's tear-streaked beauty and her seemingly undeniable wounds, and he believed her. Unable to discern the truth through the fog of his own emotions, he sought a sign, a piece of tangible evidence that could guide his hand. He commanded that both be examined. He first approached his wife. Taking her hands, he smelled them, seeking any sign of a struggle, but found nothing. He then went to his son and did the same. As he drew near the prince, he was met with the clean, pure scent of rosewater, the fragrance of innocence. But when he returned to Shahnameh and smelled the torn fabric of her robes, he was struck by the heavy, intoxicating scent of wine and musk, the perfumes with which she had prepared herself for her attempted seduction. In that moment, a flicker of clarity pierced the king's confusion. He knew. The evidence of the senses confirmed what the logic of character had already told him. His son was spotless, and his wife was the guilty party. For a brief instant, the king was a king. A cold rage filled him, and he resolved to execute Shahnameh for her treachery, for threatening his son and his kingdom with her lies. But his resolve was as fleeting as a desert mirage. Shahnameh, seeing the tide turn against her, unleashed her most potent weapon, her own seductive power over the king. She fell at his feet, confessed a partial truth that she had perhaps acted foolishly out of an excess of motherly love. And she reminded him of her powerful father, the king of Kamavarun, and the political chaos that her death would unleash. Her tears, her beauty, and his own deep-seated infatuation were too much for his weak will to overcome. His kingly rage evaporated, replaced by the familiar fog of indecision and desire. He could not bring himself to punish her. He loved her too much, and he feared the consequences. And so he chose the path of the coward. He chose to do nothing. He placed Shahnameh under a form of house arrest, a gentle slap on the wrist, and declared the matter closed. But the matter was not closed. The poison of the accusation, once spoken, could not be recalled. A shadow of doubt now clung to the prince's name, not because anyone truly believed him guilty, but because the king's failure to punish the guilty party left the verdict hanging in the air. Siyâvash was vindicated in fact, but not in deed. He was left in an impossible position, his name tainted by a crime he did not commit, and a king who would not fully defend him. The king's weakness, his inability to choose justice over passion, had done a far deeper wound to his son than the queen's lie. It had shown Siyâvash that in his father's court, truth was a negotiable commodity, and honor was secondary to desire. It was a lesson that would settle deep in the prince's soul, a quiet sorrow that would eventually drive him to seek his destiny far from the corrupting influence of his father's throne. The king's vacillation and his failure to deliver a decisive and just verdict plunged the court into a state of suspended animation. The scandal lingered, an unspoken tension that polluted the very air of the palace. Siyâvash, though known to be innocent by all who mattered, felt the stain of the unresolved accusation as a constant suffocating weight. He saw how the courtiers would fall silent when he entered a room, how their gazes would carry a mixture of pity and speculation. His honor, which was to him more precious than life itself, had been publicly assaulted, and his own father had failed to be its champion. The injustice of it all carved a deep wound in his soul. He withdrew from the life of the court, finding solace only in solitude, in prayer, and in the quiet company of his horse. He understood that as long as Shahnameh remained unpunished, her influence a poison at the king's ear, his own position was untenable. He was a symbol of a truth the king wished to forget, a living reminder of a moment of royal weakness. This agonizing stalemate could not last. The pressure for a final, definitive resolution grew, not just from the prince's supporters, but from the very structure of the cosmos as it was understood. An accusation of this magnitude against the heir to the throne demanded a judgment that was beyond the compromised authority of a biased king. It required a verdict from the gods themselves. The solution, ancient and terrible, was the trial by fire. It was a sacred ordeal, a final appeal to the divine based on the belief that the elemental purity of fire would not harm the innocent but would consume the guilty. The idea was seized upon by all factions of the court. For Siyâvash's allies, it was a chance for him to wash away the last remnants of the scandal in a blaze of glory. For Shahnameh's faction, it was a final, desperate gamble to destroy him. And for the weak king, it was the perfect escape from his own responsibility, a way to let the heavens make the decision he was too cowardly to make himself. Kavos decreed that the ordeal would take place. A sense of dread and anticipation fell over the capital. On the plains outside the city, a spectacle of terrifying grandeur was prepared. An immense quantity of wood was gathered and piled into two great mountains, leaving a narrow passage between them. The pyre was so vast that its scale defied imagination, a testament to the gravity of the judgment it was to deliver. On the day of the trial, a vast crowd gathered, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. Siyâvash prepared himself not as a defendant, but as a man keeping an appointment with his own destiny. He rejected all signs of mourning or fear. He bathed, perfumed himself with camphor and musk, and dressed himself in robes of pure, immaculate white, the color of innocence. He mounted his magnificent black steed, Shahnameh, his face serene, his heart at peace. He knew his own truth, and he had an unwavering faith that the divine order of the world would recognize it. He rode before his father, the king, and spoke to him with a quiet, sorrowful dignity, not with anger or accusation. He stated that he was undertaking this ordeal not for himself, but for his father's name, to clear the honor of the royal house that had been so grievously stained. He then turned his gaze towards the heavens and uttered a prayer, placing his fate entirely in the hands of the Creator. As the pyre was lit, the wood, soaked in pitch, erupted into a colossal wall of fire. The two mountains of wood became two roaring volcanoes of flame, the heat so intense that it drilled the spectators back, the sound a deafening roar like 1,000 dragons. The passage between them was a tunnel of incandescent death, a gateway to the inferno. The world held its breath. The moment of truth had arrived. Siyâvash, his white robes, a stark contrast against the blackness of his horse and the terrifying orange of the fire, spurred Shahnameh forward. He did not hesitate. He did not flinch. With a cry of faith on his lips, he plunged into the heart of the fire, disappearing from sight into the roaring, shimmering curtain of flame. A collective gasp of horror and awe rose from the crowd. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, there was only the sound of the fire, a consuming, elemental roar that seemed to have swallowed the prince and his hopes whole. The king himself cried out in anguish, believing he had sent his perfect son to a horrific death. The world stood still, caught in a moment of unbearable suspense, waiting for the verdict of the flames. The moments Siyâvash spent within the heart of the fire were a passage outside of time, a journey through a realm of pure, roaring energy. The heat was a physical blow, the light a blinding torrent, the sound an all-consuming thunder. Yet, as the flames licked at him and his steed, they found nothing to purchase upon. His white robes did not blacken, his skin did not blister, the mane of his horse was not singed. His innocence was a shield, a cool and invisible armor that the inferno could not penetrate. To the terrified astonishment of the watching thousands, he emerged from the other side of the fiery passage. He rode out from the roaring heart of the blaze as calmly as if he were emerging from a morning mist. The vision was so miraculous, so utterly unbelievable, that for a moment the crowd was struck silent, unable to process what their eyes were seeing. The prince, immaculate and serene, rode his black horse out of the inferno, completely and perfectly unscathed. Then the silence broke. A sound erupted from the crowd, a single, unified roar of joy, of relief, of vindicated faith. It was a sound that shook the very plains, a thunderous acclamation for their beloved prince, a cry of praise for the divine justice that had so clearly and so spectacularly been delivered. Men wept openly, soldiers raised their swords in salute, and a wave of euphoria swept through the assembled masses. Siyâvash had not just been proven innocent, he had been sanctified. He had walked through the valley of death and had been protected by the hand of God. King Siyâvash, who had been weeping in despair, was overcome with a convulsive joy. He spurred his own horse forward, dismounted, and ran to his son, embracing him, kissing his face and hands, begging for his forgiveness. In that moment, all his weakness, all his doubt, was washed away by the overwhelming tide of relief and paternal love. The court, the army, the people all surged forward, wanting to touch the prince who had been blessed by heaven, to be near this figure of almost supernatural purity. He was no longer just a prince. He was a living legend, a hero whose virtue had been tested by the ultimate ordeal and had been found perfect. His vindication was absolute, his honor restored not just to its former state, but polished to a blinding brilliance by the very flames that were meant to destroy it. In the midst of this wild celebration, only one person felt the cold chill of doom: the queen, Shahnameh. She had watched from her pavilion, her heart freezing with terror as he rode out of the fire. She had gambled against God and had lost. His miraculous survival was her death sentence. She knew now there would be no escape. The king, his love for his son rekindled and his authority restored by this divine sign, would show her no mercy. The trial by fire had ended. The truth, in all its terrifying and beautiful clarity, was revealed to the world. Siyâvash stood vindicated, his name cleared, his honor shining brighter than ever. But the ashes of the great pyre had not yet settled, and the deep wounds that this affair had carved into the heart of the royal family and the kingdom itself were far from healed. The fire had purified the prince, but it had also illuminated the depths of the court's corruption and the king's fatal weakness. The joyous celebrations that followed Siyâvash's vindication were a temporary balm on a festering wound. The king, filled with a renewed sense of righteous fury, now turned his attention to his treacherous queen. The divine judgment was clear, and his duty was equally clear. He ordered Shahnameh to be seized and brought forth for execution. Her crime of false accusation against the heir to the throne was the highest form of treason, and the punishment was death. But Siyâvash, in the moment of his greatest triumph, revealed the profound depth of his character. He, the victim of her lies, the one who had been forced to face the inferno because of her malice, now became her sole advocate. He went before his father and pleaded for his stepmother's life. He argued that to execute her would bring shame upon the king himself, that her death would not erase the dishonor but would only compound it with more bloodshed. He asked that his own vindication be a cause for mercy, not for vengeance. This act of almost unbelievable magnanimity stunned the court. It was a testament to a soul so pure that it was incapable of holding hatred. The king, moved by his son's plea and perhaps secretly relieved to have an excuse to spare the woman he still loved, relented. Shahnameh's life was spared, her crime officially forgiven at the request of her intended victim. But this act of mercy, noble as it was, did not restore harmony to the court. For Siyâvash, the ordeal had been a profound and disillusioning awakening. He had seen the treacherous depths of the human heart in his stepmother. He had seen the dangerous unreliability of his father's judgment. He had seen that the entire world of the court, with its whispers, its factions, and its intrigues, was a place where his own rigid and uncompromising honor would always be in peril. Though he was now celebrated as a hero, he felt a deep sense of alienation, a spiritual exile in his own home. The trust between father and son, once broken, could not be perfectly mended. Siyâvash looked at Siyâvash with a mixture of love and guilt. Siyâvash looked at his father with a dutiful respect that was now tinged with a sorrowful and knowing disappointment. The palace, which should have been his home, now felt like a cage, its gilded walls echoing with the memory of betrayal and injustice. He longed for a purpose, for a noble endeavor that could take him away from this toxic atmosphere, a challenge that could be met with the clean, straightforward virtues he had learned from Rostam. He needed a battlefield of honor to erase the memory of a courtroom of deceit. That opportunity soon arrived, as it always did, from the east. News came that the perennial enemy, Turan, was once again massing its armies on the frontier. The Great War, which had been dormant, was threatening to erupt anew. For the king's hawkish advisors, it was a threat. For Siyâvash, it was an escape. He immediately volunteered to lead the Iranian army against the forces of the Turanian king, Afrasiab. He presented it as his duty, a chance to serve the kingdom and prove his valor. But in his heart, it was a desperate flight towards a world he understood, a world of clear-cut conflict, of courage and strategy, where a man was judged by his deeds, not by the whispers of a seductress. King Kavus, eager to see his son achieve glories that would permanently silence any lingering whispers from the scandal, readily agreed. He gave Siyâvash command of a vast army and sent him to the frontier with his blessings. As Siyâvash rode out of the capital at the head of his troops, a great sense of relief washed over him. He was leaving behind the suffocating world of the court, the ambiguous shadows of intrigue, and riding towards the stark, clear light of the battlefield. He was finally free, a warrior prince on a noble quest. But fate, in its infinite and cruel irony, was leading him not towards a straightforward battle, but towards a far more complex and tragic test of his honor, a test that would ultimately force him to choose between his country and his soul. The Grand Army of Iran, with Prince Siyâvash at its head, was a magnificent sight, a river of steel and silk flowing eastward toward the troubled frontier. For Siyâvash, the campaign was a spiritual renewal. The crisp discipline of the military camp, the straightforward loyalty of the soldiers, and the clear, unambiguous nature of his mission were a soothing balm to his wounded spirit. He proved to be a commander of exceptional skill, not just in tactics, but in winning the hearts of his men. His personal courage was matched only by his compassion, and his army followed him with a devotion that bordered on worship. Upon reaching the frontier, he found the Turanian forces formidable, led by a general named Siyâvash, the brother of the Turanian king, Afrasiab. Siyâvash, however, did not rush into a bloody and decisive battle. His nature was not that of a conqueror, but of a restorer of order. He waged a campaign that was both brilliant and humane. He outmaneuvered the Turanian armies, winning a series of strategic victories that pushed them back and secured the Iranian borderlands. But he did so with a minimum of bloodshed, always preferring a clever stratagem to a costly frontal assault. After a string of defeats, the Turanian commanders began to understand that they were facing a new kind of Iranian leader. This was not a reckless king seeking plunder and glory, but a wise prince who seemed to value peace above all else. King Afrasiab of Turan, a ruler known for his fierce temper but also for moments of pragmatic insight, received news of his army's defeats with a growing sense of alarm and curiosity. He had expected a long and bloody war, but instead he saw his forces being systematically dismantled with an almost surgical precision. He also heard tales of the Iranian prince's character, of his justice, his mercy towards prisoners, and his profound piety. Intrigued and sensing an opportunity, Afrasiab decided to change his strategy. Instead of sending more armies to their defeat, he chose the path of diplomacy. He sent envoys to Siyâvash's camp, not with threats, but with a proposal for peace. He offered to end the war, to cede the disputed territories back to Iran, and to provide 100 high-born Turanian nobles as hostages to guarantee his sincerity. It was a victory beyond anything Siyâvash had hoped for. He had achieved all of Iran's strategic goals without plunging the two nations into another generation of devastating warfare. He had proven that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to preserve. He accepted Afrasiab's terms, welcomed the Turanian hostages into his camp with honor and respect, and established a truce. He had forged a peace built on mutual respect, a fragile but beautiful bridge across the river of blood that had so long divided the two great empires. With his heart full of pride and a deep sense of accomplishment, he sent a messenger to his father, the king, to report the triumphant news. He described his military victories, the retreat of the enemy, and the incredibly favorable terms of the peace treaty he had secured. He expected his father to be overjoyed, to praise him for winning such a conclusive victory with such wisdom and restraint. He awaited the royal reply, confident that he had finally, unequivocally, proven his worth and served his country with perfect honor. He could not have known that this great triumph, this act of enlightened statesmanship, would be the very thing that would set him on the road to his own destruction. The king, in his distant and decadent capital, was a man easily swayed by the voices around him, and those voices were not the voices of peace. The messenger from Siyâvash's camp arrived at the court of Kavus and delivered the news of the prince's stunning success. The war was won, the enemy had submitted, and a favorable peace was at hand. A wise and secure ruler would have celebrated this news as the greatest of all possible victories. But Kavus was neither wise nor secure. His court was filled with hawkish old warriors and ambitious nobles who saw war as the only true path to glory and riches. They viewed Siyâvash's negotiated peace not as a triumph of statesmanship, but as a betrayal of their martial ambitions. They began to whisper in the king's ear, planting seeds of doubt and avarice. They argued that Siyâvash had been too soft, that he should have pressed his advantage, annihilated the Turanian army, and marched on their capital. They spoke of the vast plunder that had been forfeited, of the chance to utterly humiliate their ancient enemy that had been squandered. They painted Siyâvash's wisdom as weakness, his mercy as naivete, and Kavus, a man whose own character was defined by a lust for grand theatrical gestures, listened. His pride was stoked by their words. The vision of a simple, elegant peace was replaced by the far more seductive vision of a total and devastating conquest. He allowed his own vanity to override his son's brilliant achievement. His reply to Siyâvash was not a message of praise, but a cold, brutal, and foolish command. He rejected the peace treaty. He ordered Siyâvash to disregard the oaths that had been sworn. He commanded him to take the 100 noble Turanian hostages who had been given as a sacred guarantee of peace and to execute them in cold blood. He then instructed his son to relaunch the war, to reject all further offers of truce, and to pursue the Turanian army with the goal of its complete and utter destruction. To ensure these brutal orders were carried out, he dispatched one of his most ruthless and war-hungry generals to Siyâvash's camp to oversee the new offensive. The arrival of the king's message in Siyâvash's camp was like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. As the prince read his father's words, his world turned to ash. He was faced with a choice so monstrous, so fundamentally opposed to the very essence of his being that it threw his soul into a state of profound crisis. His father, the king, had commanded him to commit an act of unspeakable evil. He was being ordered to murder 100 innocent men who had placed their lives in his hands, trusting in his honor. He was being ordered to break a sacred oath, a vow made not just to an enemy king, but in the eyes of God. For a man like Siyâvash, whose entire identity was built upon the bedrock of his integrity, this was not just a difficult order, it was an impossible one. To obey his father would be to destroy his own soul. It would be to become the very thing he despised, a treacherous, dishonorable man, a butcher of innocence. The throne that would be his one day would be forever tainted by this act of barbarism. All the virtue he had cultivated, the reputation he had so carefully built, would be rendered a lie. But to disobey his father was an act of treason. It would mean defying his king, turning his back on his country, and becoming an outcast, a rebel. He was trapped in an ethical labyrinth where every path led to a different kind of ruin. He could preserve his honor and lose his kingdom, or preserve his kingdom and lose his honor. For Siyâvash, the choice, as agonizing as it was never truly in doubt. A kingdom without honor was a prison. A life without integrity was a living death. He would not, could not, commit the monstrous act his father had commanded. His soul was not for sale at any price. This moment of decision was the true turning point of his life. It was the moment he stepped away from the path of a prince and onto the path of a martyr. The moment he chose the purity of his own spirit over all the glittering prizes the world had to offer. The weight of the king's cruel command settled upon Siyâvash not as a burden, but as a terrible clarifying force. It stripped away all illusions and left him with a single, unalterable truth. He could no longer serve a master who commanded him to be a monster. His loyalty to his own conscience, to the divine laws of justice and honor, superseded his loyalty to a flawed and foolish earthly king. He made his decision, a choice that was both an act of supreme moral courage and a tragic, irreversible severing of the bonds that tied him to his past. He called together his most trusted advisors and laid bare his crisis, his voice heavy with a sorrow that was deeper than any battlefield wound. He explained that he would not break his oath, that he would not murder the hostages entrusted to his care. He would rather face death, exile, and eternal condemnation from his own people than commit such a sin. His first act was to uphold his vow. He summoned the Turanian hostages, and instead of leading them to the executioner's block, he treated them with even greater honor. He returned the tribute he had accepted, bestowed upon them lavish gifts from his own treasury, and set them free to return to their king, Afrasiab. He sent with them a message explaining the madness that had seized the Iranian king and his own refusal to partake in it. He was, in effect, declaring his moral independence from his own nation. With this act, he had crossed the Rubicon. There was no turning back. He could not return to Iran, for to do so would be to face his father's wrath and a charge of high treason. He could not stay on the frontier, caught between two armies, a commander with no king. He was a man without a country, his only possession, the unsullied honor he had chosen to preserve. He saw only one path forward, a perilous and uncertain road that led not west towards home, but east, deeper into the land of his enemies. He decided to throw himself upon the mercy of the very king he had been sent to fight. He would go to Turan, not as a conqueror or a refugee, but as a prince who had chosen honor over ambition, seeking sanctuary among those who could understand the value of a sacred oath. He explained his decision to his army, releasing them from their vows of service to him and advising them to return to Iran. Many of his soldiers who loved him as a father wept at his decision, begging him to lead them in rebellion against Kai Kavus. But Siyâvash refused. His quarrel was not with his country, only with its king's unjust command. He would not be the cause of a civil war. He chose the path of solitary sacrifice. Accompanied by only a small band of his most loyal followers, he turned his back on the land of his birth, on the throne that was his birthright, on everything he had ever known. He rode towards the hostile and unknown realm of Turan, a self-imposed exile, a prince choosing to become a wanderer. It was an act of profound and tragic grandeur, a testament to a man who valued the kingdom within his own soul more than any earthly empire. As he crossed the border, leaving Iran behind, he was not fleeing in defeat, but marching into a new life, guided only by the unwavering compass of his own integrity. He was a beacon of light, and he had chosen to walk into the darkness, trusting that his own flame would be enough to guide his way. The news of Siyâvash's extraordinary decision reached the court of Afrasiab, the king of Turan, and was met with a mixture of disbelief and profound suspicion. The Turanian nobles could not comprehend his actions. They saw it as a trick, an elaborate Persian stratagem designed to lull them into a false sense of security. They urged their king to treat the approaching prince as a spy and an enemy, to seize him and execute him. But there was one voice at the Turanian court that counseled a different path, the voice of Piran, the king's oldest and wisest advisor. Piran was a man of great insight and experience, and he saw in Siyâvash's actions not deceit, but the mark of a truly noble and extraordinary spirit. He argued passionately before Afrasiab, convincing him that a man who would sacrifice a kingdom for the sake of an oath was a man to be trusted, not feared. To welcome such a paragon of honor, Piran argued, would be a greater victory than any won on the battlefield. It would be a moral triumph that would bring glory to Turan. Afrasiab, who for all his ferocity possessed a deep-seated respect for heroic virtue, was swayed by Piran's wisdom. He agreed to receive Siyâvash not as a foe, but as an honored guest. He sent a magnificent procession, led by Piran himself, to greet the exiled prince and escort him to the capital. The meeting between Siyâvash and Piran was a meeting of kindred spirits. The young, idealistic prince and the old, wise counselor recognized in each other a shared understanding of the world, a common devotion to the principles of justice and honor. A deep and abiding friendship was forged between them, a bond that would become Siyâvash's primary source of strength and comfort in this alien land. Siyâvash's arrival in the Turanian capital was a grand spectacle. Afrasiab, convinced of his sincerity, welcomed him with a warmth and generosity that was stunning in its scope. He held great feasts in his honor, showered him with priceless gifts, and treated him not as a defeated enemy or a humble refugee, but as an equal, a fellow prince. Siyâvash, with his natural grace and quiet dignity, quickly won the admiration of the entire Turanian court. His skill in the royal pastimes of polo, hunting, and archery was unmatched, but it was the purity of his character that truly captivated them. He was a living embodiment of the chivalric ideal, a hero straight from the pages of legend. Afrasiab's admiration for the young prince grew into a deep, fatherly affection. He saw in Siyâvash the noble qualities that were so often lacking in his own court. He sought to bind this paragon of virtue to himself and his kingdom forever. He offered Siyâvash the hand of his own dutiful and virtuous daughter, Farangis, in marriage. It was the highest honor he could bestow, a gesture that would transform the exiled prince from a guest into a son. Siyâvash, who had found in Turan the respect and appreciation he had been denied in his own homeland, accepted. The wedding was a magnificent affair, a symbol of the hoped-for peace and reconciliation between the two warring nations. For a time, it seemed that Siyâvash had found a new life, a new home. He had traded the suspicion and intrigue of the Iranian court for the open heart and admiration of the Turanians. He had lost a foolish father in Kavus, but gained a wise and loving one in Piran, and a powerful, if unpredictable, protector in Afrasiab. He had found a loving wife and the promise of a future. It was a period of blissful peace, a calm and sunlit harbor after a terrible storm. But the serpent of envy is a creature that can be found in any garden, no matter how well tended. And even in this newfound paradise, the seeds of a new and even more terrible tragedy were already being sown in the dark and jealous heart of a man who could not bear to see such a brilliant light shine. For a time, Siyâvash's life in Turan was a portrait of idyllic peace and prosperity. King Afrasiab, in a grand gesture of his affection and trust, granted his new son-in-law his own province to rule, a fertile and beautiful land on the eastern marches of the kingdom. Here, far from the capital and its lingering intrigues, Siyâvash was free to build a world in his own image. He embarked on this task with the same methodical grace and artistry that he brought to all things. He chose a site of great natural beauty and began the construction of a new city, a city that would be a testament to his ideals of order, justice, and harmony. He was not just a ruler, he was an architect of the soul, and his city was to be a physical manifestation of his own inner world. He named it Siyâvashgird, the city built by Siyâvash. Every aspect of its design reflected his character. The walls were strong and symmetrical, symbolizing security and order. The streets were wide and clean, the gardens lush and meticulously planned, representing beauty and tranquility. At its heart, he built a magnificent palace, not of ostentatious luxury, but of elegant and understated grandeur. The city became a magnet for the greatest artists, craftsmen, and scholars of the land. Siyâvash ruled over his domain with a wisdom and compassion that was legendary. His justice was impartial, his taxes were fair, and his court was a place of learning and culture, not of flattery and deceit. Siyâvashgird became a paradise, a beacon of civilization, a utopian experiment brought to life. It was a place where merit was valued over birth, where peace was cherished above war, and where honor was the currency of the realm. Siyâvash's happiness was made complete by his deep and loving relationship with his wife, Farangis. In her, he had found a partner whose own noble spirit matched his. Their love was a source of great strength, and soon their union was blessed with the news that Ferengis was with child. Siyâvash, the exile, had found a new home, a new purpose, and the promise of a new lineage. He had built a perfect world, a sanctuary of peace in the midst of a turbulent and violent age. The stories of Siyâvashgerd and its wise and noble ruler spread throughout Turan, and even back into Iran, where his memory was cherished by the people who still mourned his loss. He had, it seemed, achieved the impossible. He had found a way to live a life of perfect integrity in an imperfect world. But perfection is a thing that a fallen world cannot long tolerate. It is a mirror that shows others their own flaws, a light that forces the creatures of shadow to scurry for cover. The very existence of Siyâvashgerd, this monument to his virtue, was an intolerable affront to those who thrived in the darkness. The jealousy that had been quietly festering in the heart of the Turanian court was about to ripen into a poisonous fruit. The architect of this envy was Siyâvash, the brother of King Afrasiab, the same general whose forces Siyâvash had defeated on the frontier. Siyâvash was a man whose soul was a withered and twisted thing, and he had harbored a deep and bitter resentment for the Persian prince from the very beginning. He had been humiliated by Siyâvash in battle, and now he was forced to watch as this foreigner was showered with honors, given the king's daughter, and celebrated as the greatest man in the kingdom. Every word of praise for Siyâvash was like a drop of acid on Siyâvash's heart. He saw the prince's virtue not as something to be admired, but as a silent rebuke to his own corrupt and scheming nature. He watched the rise of Siyâvashgerd, and he saw not a beacon of peace, but a rival center of power, a threat to his own influence over his brother, the king. A venomous and obsessive jealousy took root in his soul, and he dedicated himself to a single evil purpose, the complete and utter destruction of Siyâvash. Siyâvash was a master of intrigue, a weaver of lies, and he began his campaign with the subtlety of a spider spinning its web. He began to spend more and more time with his brother, King Afrasiab, and in their private moments, he would plant the first dark seeds of doubt. He would praise Siyâvash with a faint and poisoned admiration, saying things like, "What a noble prince he is, so beloved by all. Some say the people love him even more than they love you, my king." He would speak of Siyâvashgerd's beauty, but would add, "And its walls are so strong. It is as much a fortress as it is a city. One wonders why he needs such formidable defenses." He played upon Afrasiab's deepest insecurities, his famously volatile temper, his deep-seated paranoia, and his lingering distrust of all things Persian. For months, Siyâvash patiently and methodically built his case, his whispers a slow-acting poison, drop by insidious drop. He intercepted letters, fabricated reports, and bribed courtiers to tell tales of the prince's growing arrogance. He suggested that Siyâvash was secretly corresponding with his father in Iran, that he was building an army, that his new city was to be the staging ground for a rebellion, a Persian dagger aimed at the heart of Turan. He painted the prince's every virtue as a mask for a treacherous ambition. His humility was a ploy to win the people's love. His justice was a strategy to build a loyal following. His magnificent city was a declaration of his intent to carve out his own kingdom. Afrasiab, whose mind had been weakened by years of absolute power and who had a natural inclination towards suspicion, slowly began to succumb to the poison. The love and admiration he had felt for his son-in-law began to curdle into a dark and fearful mistrust. He started to see Siyâvash not as the paragon of honor he had welcomed, but as a cunning Persian serpent he had foolishly nurtured in his own bosom. The image of the loyal son was replaced by the terrifying specter of the ambitious rival. Siyâvash, seeing that the poison was taking hold, knew that the time had come to deliver the final, fatal dose. He convinced the king that he should go to Siyâvashgerd himself to see with his own eyes the evidence of the prince's treason. Afrasiab agreed, his heart now a battlefield between his fading affection and his growing fear. The trap, so carefully and so maliciously constructed, was now ready to be sprung. Siyâvash, in his peaceful city, remained blissfully unaware of the storm that was gathering, trusting in his own innocence and in the honor of the king who had treated him as a son. He was a perfect and unsuspecting lamb, and the wolves were now gathering at his gate. The news of King Afrasiab's impending visit reached Siyâvashgard, and Siyâvash, with no knowledge of the poison that had infected the king's mind, prepared to welcome his father-in-law with all the honor and love that was his due. He arranged a reception of unparalleled splendor, a display of loyalty and affection intended to delight the king. But before Afrasiab himself arrived, Gharzivaz came as an advance envoy, his face a mask of false friendship that concealed his murderous intent. He praised Siyâvash for his magnificent city, but warned him with a feigned and treacherous concern that the king was in a foul and suspicious mood. Gharzivaz advised Siyâvash not to display the full extent of his military forces during the welcoming parade, lest the paranoid king misinterpret it as a show of force, a threat. Siyâvash, who thought Gharzivaz a friend, trusted his advice and arranged only a modest honor guard. Having thus disarmed his victim, Gharzivaz then secretly rode back to meet the king's approaching retinue. He reported to Afrasiab with a face full of feigned alarm, telling him that Siyâvash was planning a full-scale military review, a clear act of intimidation. Then, when the king saw only a small token force, Gharzivaz whispered that Siyâvash was being cunning, hiding the true size of his army to conceal his treacherous plans. With every move, Gharzivaz twisted innocence into guilt, loyalty into rebellion. By the time Afrasiab arrived at Siyâvashgard, his mind was a cauldron of suspicion, ready to see treason in every gesture of welcome. Siyâvash greeted him with open arms, but the king's response was cold and distant. During the magnificent feasts and celebrations that Siyâvash had prepared, Afrasiab remained sullen and watchful, his gaze sweeping over the strong walls and the loyal followers of the prince, not with admiration, but with the paranoid eyes of a man seeing a fortress and an army of rebels. After a few days of this tense and joyless visit, Gharzivaz convinced the king that the time had come to summon Siyâvash back to the capital. The command was issued. It was not an invitation, but a cold imperial summons. A deep and terrible premonition began to form in Siyâvash's heart. He saw the coldness in the king's eyes. He felt the oppressive atmosphere of suspicion, and he began to understand that a terrible change had occurred. His wife, Farangis, begged him not to go. She had seen the malice in her uncle Gharzivaz's eyes and the fear in her father's. She pleaded with him to flee, to take her and their unborn child and seek refuge in some distant land. Siyâvash was plunged into a final, tragic dilemma. He knew the danger. He had dreamt of ill omens, of rivers of blood, and a world consumed by fire. Every instinct told him that to go to the capital was to walk into a trap from which he would not return. Yet, to flee would be to give the appearance of guilt. It would be an admission of the very treason he was being accused of. His entire life had been a testament to the principle that an innocent man has nothing to fear from the truth. To run now would be a betrayal of his own deepest convictions. He stood at a final crossroads. He could flee and save his life, but in doing so, he would allow a lie to become his story. Or he could face his accusers and trust in his own innocence, even if it meant walking into the jaws of death. With a heartbreaking and stoic resignation, he made his choice. He would not run. He would not hide. He would face his fate with the same unwavering honor with which he had lived his life. He comforted his weeping wife, entrusting her and their unborn child to the care of the wise Piran. He told her of his prophetic dreams, that she would bear a son, Khosrow, who would one day be the king of Iran and who would be the instrument of his vengeance. He then dressed himself not as a warrior, but as a man prepared to meet his God. He put his affairs in order, and accompanied by a small retinue, he began the final journey to the capital, to the court of the king who had once been his savior and was now to be his executioner. He was an innocent man, walking willingly towards his own doom, his only shield, the very integrity that had been twisted into a weapon against him. The arrival of Siyâvash in the capital of Turan was not the celebrated return of a beloved prince, but the somber arrival of a condemned man. The atmosphere of the court was thick with hostility, the faces of the nobles cold and unforgiving. The web of lies woven by Garsivas had done its work completely. Siyâvash was led before the throne of Afrasiab, and he looked upon the face of the king who had been like a father to him. But the face he saw now was not one of affection, but a mask of cold, implacable rage, his eyes clouded by the poison of suspicion. Afrasiab, his voice trembling with fury, leveled the charges of treason and rebellion against his son-in-law. Siyâvash listened to the litany of fabricated crimes, his expression one of profound sorrow, not of fear. When the king had finished, Siyâvash spoke, his voice calm and steady amidst the storm of hatred. He did not beg for his life, nor did he rail against the injustice. He simply, and with a quiet and unshakable dignity, denied the charges. He spoke of his loyalty, of the life he had built, of the peace he had cherished. He reminded Afrasiab of the oaths that had passed between them. But his words were like stones cast into a raging sea. The king's heart was closed, his mind sealed shut by the lies he had chosen to believe. Garsivas and the other courtiers who had conspired against the prince fanned the flames of the king's rage, demanding the immediate execution of the Persian traitor. They clamored for his blood, eager to see the man whose goodness had been a silent judgment upon them all finally brought low. Siyâvash looked around the hostile court and saw that there was no hope of justice, no possibility of truth being heard. He saw that his fate had been decided long before he had arrived. In that moment, a profound and tragic peace settled over him. He had done all that an honorable man could do. He had lived a life of truth, and he would face a death of injustice with the same unwavering integrity. He ceased his defense and fell silent, his stillness a more powerful statement than any words. He stood before the raging tyrant, a solitary island of calm and an ocean of malice, his spirit unbowed, his honor untouched. He knew he was about to die, but he also knew that his innocence was absolute, a truth that his death could not erase. Afrasiab, seeing the prince's stoic silence not as a sign of dignity but as an admission of guilt, gave the final, terrible order. He commanded his guards to seize the prince and drag him to the place of execution. The final act of the tragedy had begun. Siyâvash was not to be given a warrior's death, nor the clean end of a noble. He was to be slaughtered like an animal, a public spectacle designed to humiliate him and to serve as a brutal warning to any who would dare to challenge the king's authority. As the guards seized him, Siyâvash did not struggle. His only thoughts were for his pregnant wife Ferengis and the son he would never see. He had entrusted them to the wise Piran, his only friend in this land of enemies, and he had faith that his lineage would survive. He had faced the trial by fire to prove his innocence to his own father, and now he would face the executioner's blade to prove it to himself. His life was forfeit, but his soul remained his own, a treasure that no tyrant could touch. He was led away from the palace, through the streets of the city, his head held high. He was a king in all but name, walking to his own coronation of martyrdom. The final scene of Siyâvash's life is one of the most heartbreaking and iconic in the entire epic, a moment of profound and terrible pathos. He was not taken to a formal place of execution, but was dragged to a desolate, barren patch of ground outside the city walls, a place of waste and refuse. It was a final, calculated insult, an attempt to stain his memory with shame. As he was forced to his knees, he raised his eyes to the heavens one last time. His final words, a prayer, not for himself, but for the son who was to be born, the son who would one day ask why his father had been so cruelly slain. He prayed that his son would grow to be a just king, a restorer of the light that was about to be extinguished. The executioner, a brutish man chosen for his cruelty, approached. Garsivas, the architect of this entire tragedy, stood nearby, his face alight with a triumphant, demonic glee, savoring the final moments of his victory. He gave the order. Siyâvash was held down, and in a brutal, sacrilegious act, his throat was cut. His innocent blood, the purest blood in the kingdom, spilled out onto the barren dust, a scarlet tide of injustice that the earth itself seemed to recoil from. The act was done. The noblest of princes was dead. His body was left unburied, a feast for carrion birds, his head impaled on a spike above the city gates. The forces of envy, suspicion, and tyranny had won. The brightest light in a generation had been extinguished. But the story of Siyâvash did not end with his death. In the world of the epic, such a monstrous crime against innocence could not go unanswered by the cosmos itself. The universe had been thrown out of balance by this act, and it would seek its own terrible and bloody rebalancing. From the very spot where Siyâvash's blood had soaked into the barren ground, a single, miraculous flower was said to have sprung forth, a beautiful, sorrowful plant that would forever be known as the blood of Siyâvash, a perennial testament to his innocence, a cry for justice from the wounded earth itself. The news of his murder spread like a poisoned wind. In Turan, his wife Ferengis was saved from the king's wrath only by the brave intervention of the wise Piran, who hid her and saw to the secret birth of her son K. Khosrow. This child, born of a murdered father and an exiled mother, would grow up with the fire of vengeance in his heart, his destiny inextricably linked to the avenging of his father's blood. When the news reached Iran, the nation was plunged into a cataclysm of grief. King Kaykaus finally awoke from his foolishness and was shattered by the realization that his own weakness and flawed commands had driven his perfect son to his death. He tore his robes, covered his throne in black, and wept with a sorrow that would never leave him. But the deepest grief was felt by the mighty hero Rostam, who had been more of a father to Siyâvash than Kaykaus had ever been. When he heard that the boy he had raised, the paragon of virtue he had nurtured, had been so brutally and unjustly murdered, a volcanic rage erupted in his soul. It was a rage that would shake the foundations of the world. He stormed the palace of Kaykaus and, in a fit of righteous fury, he seized the queen, Shahnameh, the ultimate source of the original lie that had set this tragedy in motion, and he killed her with his own hands, a final, brutal act of justice for his beloved foster son. The death of Siyâvash did not bring peace or stability to the paranoid king of Turan. It brought the opposite. It became the casus belli for a new and terrible chapter in the endless war between the two nations. It was no longer a war for territory or for political advantage. It became a sacred war of vengeance, a blood feud on an epic scale. Rostam, his heart broken and his soul burning for retribution, led the armies of Iran into Turan, and he unleashed a storm of destruction so complete, so devastating, that the land itself cried out in agony. The cycle of violence that Siyâvash, the man of peace, had tried so desperately to end was now renewed with an apocalyptic ferocity. His death had not been an end. It was a beginning, the beginning of a long and terrible darkness, a war that would be fought in his name and would not end until the land was washed clean by a river of blood. The legacy of Siyâvash is one of the most profound and enduring in the epic tradition, a testament to the idea that the true measure of a hero is not found in victory, but in virtue. He is the archetypal tragic hero, a figure whose greatness is defined not by the throne he wins, but by the moral compromises he refuses to make. His story is a powerful and timeless exploration of the conflict between personal integrity and political reality. He is a man who is destroyed by the very world he is too good for. His refusal to break his oath, his refusal to flee in the face of false accusation, his choice to die rather than live with a stained honor, elevates him to the status of a secular saint, a martyr for the cause of his own conscience. His life becomes a mirror held up to the other characters, revealing their own flaws in stark relief: the weakness of his father, the lust and malice of his stepmother, the paranoia of his father-in-law, the corrosive envy of the court. Against the black backdrop of their failings, his own integrity shines with an almost unbearable brilliance. In the national consciousness of Persia, Siyâvash became a symbol of lost purity, of innocence betrayed. His story resonated deeply with a people who often found themselves at the mercy of treacherous politics and the whims of unjust rulers. He represented the ideal of Persian nobility and chivalry, a standard of conduct that was to be aspired to, even if it led to tragedy. His name became synonymous with the suffering of the innocent, and his memory was invoked for centuries as a powerful lament against the injustices of the world. The war of vengeance that followed his death, led by Rostam and eventually brought to its conclusion by his own son, Khosrow, forms the central and most dramatic arc of the Shahnameh. His blood is the seed from which the epic's greatest conflicts and most heroic deeds spring forth. He is the still point around which the whirlwind of the narrative turns. His tragedy is the engine that drives the story for another generation. Ultimately, Siyâvash's legacy is a profound paradox. In life, he lost everything: his home, his kingdom, his family, and finally his life itself. He was defeated by the forces of corruption and deceit. But in death, he achieved a victory more lasting than any earthly king. He became an immortal symbol of honor. He lives on not as a ruler of cities, but as a ruler of the heart. A timeless reminder that there are some things more precious than life, and that the only true kingdom worth possessing is the untarnished kingdom of one's own soul. The single flower that grew from the soil, soaked with his blood, is the perfect metaphor for his story. From an act of brutal and barren injustice, a thing of fragile, sorrowful, and eternal beauty is born. His voice was silenced, but his story would be told forever. An epic tragedy that continues to echo through the ages, a testament to the prince who chose to lose the world in order to save himself.